May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and during this National Month of Awareness, mental health agencies are encouraging people around the country to learn more, offer support, and have open and honest conversations about mental health. And that is exactly what we are doing today on the special report, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
During this month, we are encouraged to have open conversations about mental health, including discussing the startling statistics. Statistics that show that one in every person in the US and one in every six youth experience a mental health disorder on a yearly basis. And you really can't talk about mental health statistics without talking about the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide amongst Black teens and young adults. The suicide rate among Black youth has doubled since 2014 and is now twice the average of that for white kids in some states like California. In 2020, 12 out of every 100,000 Black youths between 18 and 24 died by suicide. Now, experts point to a myriad of reasons, from exposure to police violence to isolation due to COVID-19. But what is really behind these statistics and what's driving this high rate of suicide amongst Black youth and young adults? And more importantly, what can all of us do to help our kids and young people who are clearly in crisis? My first guest is Dr. Janelle Goodwill. She is a professor at the University of Chicago, and her research focuses on the intersection of mental health, race, and gender, with a particular focus on suicide and depression in Black Americans. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Goodwill.
Hi, Areva. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I use the word crisis and I kind of hesitate because I feel like we have so many crises right now that we're managing in this country, from the war to the pandemic. But, legitimately, are we in a crisis as we think about Black teens and youth and this rising suicide rate that's getting a lot of national attention?
I would certainly say that we are in a time of crisis as it relates to mental health and these rising rates of suicide among young people, particularly young Black people. I think it's important to note that when we look at the data, that suicide is actually not a new phenomenon among Black youth. There's data going back to the 1980s released by the CDC that showed an increase in suicide at that time among Black youth. And there were researchers who in the 1980s were really pointing to this issue and encouraging people to begin paying attention to these issues. I think what's new in these trends is that there's been a greater focus and a push from clinicians and also from the government, from NIH, that's provided funding for suicide prevention efforts among Black youth, but also we've seen an increase in suicides among young children, so those younger than 12. And so that, I think, has been particularly alarming. Also, what we're seeing in that research coming from teams out of Ohio State and NYU are reporting that there's an increase, particularly among Black girls, which is unusual previously when compared to earlier studies. This gap between Black girls and Black boys is narrowing. Typically, we've seen suicides become most common among Black boys, but we're seeing a particular increase in girls during this time as well. So in short, I would certainly say that we're in a crisis and we're seeing some different trends that I think are raising a lot of alarms for people during this time.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Black girls and that the fact that the gap between girls and boys is closing. There was this horrific story that caught my attention of 19-year-old Arlana Miller, a beautiful young girl, cheerleader at Southern University. She committed suicide this month, actually. I mean, just a week ago or so, her story was in the news. She left an Instagram post where she talked about the fact that she had been dead inside for a while. She said that she had planned to take her life after years of struggling. She referenced COVID-19. She referenced being isolated. Also talked about the fact that she had a torn ACL and that she was struggling in classes. Is her story unique? Unique in the sense that here she is, a college student, seemingly has her entire future ahead of her, bright future, but yet she's struggling, and she's talking about having been in this struggle for a while.
Well, Areva, unfortunately, I would say that while Arlana's public post and the notoriety that it's gained since it became public is certainly something that we're paying attention to, the risk factors and the issues that she's bringing up in that post are not unique. And I say this because I actually wrote my dissertation on suicide and depression in Black college students. And I think it's important for us to understand some distinctions in the sense that there's a strong focus on youth, and we need that. But I think that sometimes we can kind of end conversations around suicide prevention at the middle school and high school level without thinking about how really the college environment is a new environment that young people really struggle with when they're transitioning to this new level, this new place, this new environment, this new space where there are new stressors and challenges that emerge. And so I think that what Arlana is bringing up in that post is not unique. I think that some of the things that students wrestle with in terms of trying to get acclimated, trying to understand and build new relationships, financial pressures, social pressures. And I think the fact of her being a cheerleader, I mean, I think that that's a huge stressor that, you know, could certainly impact someone's mental health or put them in a position where they feel like they always have to perform. And so there's a number of things that are mentioned in the post there, but I do think that what she's bringing up is not terribly unique and is certainly experienced by Black students at colleges across the country.
What about this Instagram post? Because Arlana did an Instagram post, and something very just startling happened to me just last night. I was tagged in an Instagram post by a friend of mine, and she tagged me to the page of a young man who appears to have been writing a suicide note. And in his Instagram post, he says goodbye to his family members and friends. He names them by name. He says he's been dealing with lonely nights and feeling isolated and not having anyone to talk to. And then he also referenced having watched his mom get killed in front of him and how much he needed people to be there for him to comfort him, but they weren't, and just how he could not take the pain. And I don't know this young man. A friend saw it. She tagged me. She tagged a bunch of news stations trying to get some attention. And so I've been communicating back and forth with her, trying to find out what she knows about this guy and whether he has in fact committed suicide, or is there any way we can get help for him. But this public suicide note, I mean, it used to be that you would hear about someone, the question would be, did they leave a note? Right? And there would be this effort to find it. And oftentimes we would never know what was contained. But it looks like with younger people, is there a trend towards being very open and posting on a social media site like Instagram that they are about to take their lives?
I would say that when we're looking at these trends over the past couple of years, I think we are seeing more young people utilize social media as really a platform for them to share what it is they're struggling with in that moment. I think what you're mentioning is certainly disturbing and disheartening to hear. And I think it aligns with what we see in Arlana's post, where they're both mentioning that this is not something new that they are just thinking of in this moment. I think sometimes it's hard for us to hear and understand that a lot of times when people are at the point where they want to end their life, that they've been thinking about that for quite some time and likely have already had a plan in place for quite some time. And so I would say that the idea to post information, to post a suicide note to social media is not new. There was a young man who was actually a rapper named Freddie E, who died by suicide in 2014. And he took to Twitter and posted his goodbye notes there. And he had a really large social media following. It was popular on YouTube and Twitter. And so that case happened several years ago. And since then, we've seen more and more people, I think, utilizing social media as a final outlet to share some of the things that maybe they struggle to share with their loved ones during their life.
Do you think, I mean, how are we, the public, people who are on social media sites who see these posts, what should our response and reaction be? Like this young man, like, give me some advice. What can I do as a stranger that doesn't know him? How do we respond to these posts?
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge here is that particularly when you are, like you mentioned, tagged in something and linked to a post to someone that you don't know, it does put you in a position where you may feel helpless. But I would say in those moments, this is really where reaching out to the administrators and staff at these social media sites directly will be your best source. On Instagram, there is an option to report something that you find alarming on those posts. And so I think that that would be the best step for someone to implement and take. Now, Twitter, social media, generally Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, they've been wrestling with these issues around posts related to mental health risk and crises for quite some time. And they have staff there who are positioned, I believe, to address these issues in the moment. And so I believe that it would be best if you see something that's alarming to press that report button, reach out to those staff directly. But if you know someone, I think contacting them immediately and asking them directly if they are at risk for ending their life right now is the very best step. I think that sometimes there's a myth that we sometimes assume that if we ask someone if they're suicidal, that will make them suicidal. And the research does not support that. I think if there's someone in your life that you know personally who you're concerned about, asking them directly if they are planning to end their life and if they have the means at their disposal to end their life is the best next step for someone to take.
Yeah, you mentioned that, the horrific story of Naomi Judd's suicide, her daughter Ashley revealing that, she was there with her mom and she steps away just for a minute to go get the door. Someone's knocking on her door and Naomi shoots herself, kills herself, uses a firearm just in that brief moment that, she stepped away from her mom. And I guess there's this notion like, can you be with someone 24/7 that may be suicidal? What do? You mentioned reporting on social media to those sites, which I think is excellent. But if you're in the presence of someone that may be suicidal, should you be getting them to a hospital, or should you just try to be there physically to have your eyes on them to help maybe prevent them from acting?
I think in those circumstances, when you are in a relationship or with someone who is at imminent risk for ending their life, I think getting them to emergency psychiatric care is the best thing that you can do. I think that it is incredibly challenging for someone who maybe is not trained or not licensed to deal with these really serious issues to try to figure this out on their own. And we're not equipped to do that. I think even a single professional doesn't do this on their own. They work in a team. And so I would encourage anyone, if you're watching right now and there's someone in your life who is reporting to you that they are suicidal, I think getting them to an emergency psychiatric facility care, whether that's an emergency room or another mental health clinic that may be local to your neighborhood, will be, I think, the best next step in terms of really working to save their life.
And so, going back to the Black teen rising suicide rate, some of the articles that have come out recently, try to identify what some of the triggers are. And they talk about the racial trauma that young people witness by watching, Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and those high profile, murder cases involving police officers, COVID-19 isolation. What are some of the other triggers that you've been able to identify in your research, which is causing these higher rates of suicide?
Well, Areva, I want to be very honest in saying that I think this is where researchers really struggle because most often when someone dies by suicide or is contemplating suicide, very rarely is it one issue or one topic or one thing that they're wrestling with. I think it's oftentimes the culmination of a series of events that have been happening likely over time. And so it can be really challenging to pinpoint one issue. And I think in research studies, we try to be really careful in saying that we've identified a cause because it can be really challenging to identify some sort of cause and effect. What I will say is that in my research, we've been able to identify associations. So some variables that we identify as being linked to or related to some outcomes. And so in my dissertation research, I found that feelings of self-blame and behavioral disengagement were things that were linked to greater odds of thinking about suicide in the past year. And so I think that those are things that people could be looking for. If you are talking with someone and they're really distributing or discussing a lot of feelings of self-blame, whether it's for things that have happened recently or in the past, I think that those are things that red flags you want to be aware of. Other research I've also conducted, there's been really a strong sense around hopelessness regarding the future. And I think that this is particularly important to consider right now during COVID-19, where we've been in this pandemic longer than any of us have anticipated. There's so much uncertainty. There's financial and material hardship. And like you mentioned, there are the public messages and really these public videos and executions of Black people that are available online. And so I think that when you look at the data, we see that among among Black Americans, these rates of suicide are highest in youth and young adulthood. Whereas when you compare that to white Americans, we see that really there are a number of white Americans who die later in life. And so I think it really is pointing to this concern around hopelessness regarding the future that impacts Black people and young Black people particularly, and it could make young Black people feel that there may be nothing to live for. And so I think addressing issues of hope, but also speaking directly to issues of self-blame is going to be important for folks who are dealing with or trying to support their loved ones who might be at risk for suicide right now.
And what are some of the common risk factors for suicide that, again, if you are the parent or the teacher or someone who is around a young person, like what should, you know, what are the obvious signs that a non-trained professional might be able to pick up on?
So I think withdrawal and isolation, which of course is, prominent during COVID-19, there's been so much withdrawal and isolation that we've seen for obvious reasons in the sense that schools were closed and young people could not be around others during this time. Another strong predictor and risk factor is previous attempt. And so young people and adults who've previously attempted suicide are certainly at greater risk for ultimately dying by suicide. And this is why it's critically important for resources to be made available to persons who've already made a suicide attempt, because there is such a greater risk that they will ultimately die by suicide unless proper resources are provided. I think also you have to really carefully consider what's available in your house and at their disposal. And so we see that there is just really concerning trends around gun violence. And really, I think a lot of times the conversations in gun violence oftentimes don't include issues of suicide, but this is a serious, serious issue. And so if there's a gun that's available in someone's home, or if there's access to anything that could be used to try to hang themselves, or even pills, which I think, is pretty commonly available, whether they're over-the-counter prescription medication or even opioids. I think that we've really got to consider and carefully think about what's available in the home at their disposal, because those will all be serious risk factors that would increase someone's likelihood of attempting and dying by suicide.
Well, when you think about withdrawal, yes, so you could say all of us have had some experience with that and loneliness because of COVID. And then I think about your typical teenager that, could be just moody just because of hormonal changes, or it could be sullen or withdrawn from the family again because of hormonal things that are happening in their bodies. How do you distinguish between that, just old-fashioned teenage, rebellious, acting out, sullenness, withdrawal, versus something that could be a sign of a mental health issue?
I think very directly, Areva, this is where asking will make the difference. You're completely right that there are just normal changes, I think, that occur during puberty that could lead to mood shifts and swings, but this is where directly asking, and again, I think culturally, this feels uncomfortable. It's something that we don't discuss or talk about, but really the science tells us that you're not placing someone at risk if you ask them directly if they are thinking about suicide. Instead, you're providing them with really an opportunity and an open door to be honest with you, because they may be reluctant or concerned or afraid to share or voice those concerns. But this is where I think parents can be helpful, that if they're concerned that their child or their teen or their loved one is at risk for suicide, or maybe considering suicide, but they're not able to distinguish between what's maybe just a bad day or what's actual suicidal risk, I think this is where asking is the most important. And I want to encourage people to visit the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, afsp.org. They actually provide a very helpful guide and a walkthrough for language, very specific language and sentences that people can use when they're preparing to have a conversation with someone who they think might be at risk for suicide. I think that that's a really helpful tool that people can use and prepare, because again, unless you've been in the situation before, you just simply may not know what to ask or what to say or how to best support someone in your life. So again, that website is afsp.org. Across the header there, you'll see that they have very specific text that says what to do when you know someone who might be at risk for suicide.
That's a great resource, and thank you for sharing that. Definitely people should check that out, because you're right. I remember even a situation with my friend at the beginning of COVID. We were walking together, and she shared with me how sad she was and how she had had feelings of suicide. And I didn't know, as a layperson, what to say, how to respond to her. And it really caught me off guard that she was being so open about it. And she is someone that had been in mental health counseling before. And she said for her, she was glad that she was in touch with how deeply depressed she was feeling, because that allowed her then to verbalize it. And then she actually went and got some help. But, I felt powerless and helpless, as you described, in terms of how to help her. So I'm going to visit that website myself. I do want to ask you about this other really disturbing story. So many of these stories, it's so hard to cover these, but we need to be talking about it, particularly during this month. And this involves a teenage white kid. Seems like a happy-go-lucky boy. He's on the internet and he gets catfished, and we know that happens to a lot of people. He thinks he's talking to a girl, that he's met a girl, and they're forming a relationship. She, who's not a she, but asks him for some intimate photographs. He takes pictures of his body parts, personal body parts, private parts, sends them across the internet, and then this person, this scammer, tries to extort him, saying, if you don't give me $3,500, I'm going to expose these intimate photographs of you. And this young kid, in a moment of, I guess, panic and feeling of shame and humiliation, kills himself. And as it turns out, there never was a girl. It was just a catfisher. It was just a scammer. And his parents are just, as you can imagine, devastated. His mom, they believe that it was just in that impulsive moment that he wasn't a kid that was otherwise depressed or suicidal. So how often does that happen with teenagers and young adults, where there's a one incident that is so humiliating that it would cause someone to take their lives?
Well, there's certainly been a series of other research studies that have been conducted well over the past 10, 20 years that focuses on impulse control, particularly among youth, adolescents whose brains are still developing, who can't quite conceptualize the fact that in this moment, this is a really painful experience, but it will not last forever. And so I think that typically we do see some serious concerns around impulse control with adolescents and youth. And I think this is where, again, having those opportunities to have the social media accounts monitored regularly, I think can be especially helpful. But this is a situation that is incredibly heartbreaking, but I do think that pointing to the impulse control is probably one of the main factors here, along with the shame and self-blame that could be contributing to this ultimate death.
What do we do about, how kids engage on the internet? Should we be doing more to teach kids about those kinds of scams? I mean, this is a 15-year-old. He maybe, didn't even know that there is such a thing as catfishing and that it happens frequently. Are we doing enough to educate our young people about these kinds of, internet scammers?
I think that there is no consensus on that right now. I think that researchers and clinicians have all sorts of different views, and I'm sure maybe some of your other guests will speak to this as well. But I think that while the internet has certainly provided exposure to some serious mental health concerns and raised some challenges in that way, I think also, on the other hand, there are some research teams who are using TikTok or using Instagram or using Twitter to try to provide mental health resources over the internet to youth who otherwise would not have access. And so I think it's certainly complicated, and I think that although there's challenges, I see opportunity for researchers and clinicians to work collaboratively along with families and administrators to really ensure that the proper resources and information is being made available on social media so that situations and circumstances like this don't continue in the future.
Yeah, definitely. We know that a lot of mental health advocates use social media to reach young people because that's where they live. That's where they spend hours and hours. So I'm not suggesting that social media shouldn't be used to help, but I'm just wondering about how much we're educating our kids about the dangers, because social media, has two sides to it. In one way, it's given us this big, democratize the flow of information, which is great. But on the other hand, we know that some people, like these scammers, use it in a way that can be incredibly harmful, and in this kid's case, even lethal. So, I hope to see more research coming out of institutions like the University of Chicago and other places around, this social media and how kids can use it in a safe way. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodwill, for joining us this morning and helping kick off this discussion we're having during Mental Health Awareness Month, particularly as it relates to that intersectionality of race and mental health issues. And thank you for all the research you're doing in this area.
Thank you so much.
All right, my next guest, these are advocates working, I'll say, boots on the ground, not in research institutions, but actually working with people, men and women, who are experiencing mental health issues. So I want to get their perspective in terms of what they're seeing. Aisha Cunningham is a mental health therapist who works in the Detroit public schools, and she's also a program officer with Pretty Brown Girl, and that's a nonprofit that focuses on Black female mental health. And also joining this morning is Brandon Johnson. He is a mental health advocate who works with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And Brandon runs a YouTube station called the Black Mental Wellness Lounge. And that YouTube page focuses on Black male mental health. So we've got it covered this morning. We got Black girls and we have Black men. Good morning, Brandon, and good morning, Aisha. First of all, thanks to both of you for the work that you're doing. But you both heard the conversation I was having with Dr. Goodwill about that horrific story of that 15-year-old teen who was scammed online. How are you, Brandon, who yourself is using social media to reach people around mental health? What advice do you have for parents in a situation where their kids might be using the internet in a way that's harmful, the way that young man did?
Absolutely. So it's a challenging thing. I think first and foremost, I don't think social media is going anywhere, right? So I think that our young people are going to be engaged on it. And I think to Dr. Goodwill's point, it's really important for us as parents. I have two young children, 10 and 8 years old, and, they're not on social media yet, but as we, working with teenagers and, working with parents is really having that conversation about, what is safe. And really, I think this is where having conversations and check-ins with our young kids, really matters. Like, how do you feel when you're using social media? Like, does it, is it positive for you? Are you just on because your friends are on? Do you find it stressful? Like, is it anxiety producing? Does it, give you feelings of, inadequacy and feeling like you have to compare yourself or, those things? I think, having those opportunities for conversations are important. And I tell parents, just be patient, be open and be what I call a safe place to land. So when we talk about young people, there may be a day where you realize that something is wrong and you're seeing something's wrong with your child, with another young person that you're working with. And that might be the day that they don't feel like talking about it. They don't feel like addressing it with you that way. And I think it's important for us to be patient, to listen without judgment, to let them know that if today is not the day, whenever you feel like it, in whatever way works for you, I'm here as a place that I'll open it up. It'll be a safe place. I'm not going to criticize you. I'm not going to demean or minimize the things that you're going through. This is a safe space to really have those conversations. And I think that is really where it starts. And we have young people that they want to talk about it. They may not want to go into all the specifics, but they may say, like, I saw something that stressed me out, or I'm experiencing, some things, or somebody made this post about me and, it really bothered me. But just getting those conversations and then providing whatever resources that we can that would work for the young person, to deal with that. I think, our approach of being like, well, just log off, like just get off. I don't think that's realistic. Our kids are just not going to jump off. It's a major part of their lives, at this point, very different from us. And so, I really think having that ability to do that, open that space up, is really important for our young people.
And Aisha, you work with a lot of young Black girls, both with the organization, but also in public schools. What are you seeing? Like, what are these school kids saying to you about the internet? Is it empowering or is it, stress inducing?
I think that it's both. For some who have displayed a level of confidence, a level of security, social media isn't really a platform that causes a lot of anxiety or stress. But the root of some of the other issues when social media does become a problem is the level of insecurities, is the confidence levels, is the student or young person who may be struggling with things internally and doesn't really have an outlet or doesn't really know how to express how they feel. And so when situations may arise with drama or conflict or things that they may kind of get involved in on the internet, it kind of also just creates more anxiety and more stress that they might already be experiencing within their lives. And they don't really have the tools to to fight back in a sense. And when I say fight back, it's more of to kind of reassure and validate and affirm themselves to say, you know what, this isn't a reflection of me. You know, there's nothing wrong with me. I am actually enough. But if I already don't feel like that, social media can just already be an added pressure.
How are you getting these Aisha, young people to open up? We know during that period, those teen periods when kids are going through puberty, they tend to, become very insular. That's not the period in their lives where they're the most talkative, where they're the most engaged, particularly with adults. So how does someone like you that works in a school setting and works, with the nonprofit Pretty Brown Girl, how are you getting these young women, young girls to open up about their feelings?
Build rapport. I think sometimes as adults, we may come from a standpoint of, well, I'm easy to talk to. I'm a good person. I'm a cool person. But positioning yourself to let them understand that I'm actually here to serve you. I'm here to get to know you because you are that important. So creating a space where they understand that their thoughts are important, who they are is important. I'm interested to know what's going on in your mind. I want to have a conversation with you. Things that you may not feel comfortable talking about with other people. This is a no judgment space. I'm not going to look at you side eyes. You don't have to worry about me spreading your business. This is not that. And so kind of just focusing on helping them to see that I'm really here for you. That's it. I have no other intention but to help you. And that kind of just allows them to also be transparent and honest. They're able to ask me questions. I always tell them that, hey, I'm going to be transparent with you. I'm going to be honest with you. If there's any questions that you want to ask me, I'm here for you. And so just building that rapport is very, very important.
And Brandon, you have a YouTube page station that's dedicated to Black male mental health. What are you finding? Like men too, men aren't the most talkative people. They don't tend to, want to share their feelings and show vulnerability. How are you getting guys to open up?
Absolutely. So the YouTube page is open to everyone. So it is open to everyone. We cover everybody. But we've had some specific dialogues specifically for Black men. We did a Black men roundtable with some brothers in mental health where we talked about this. And for men, I think it's a space of setting up a safe place and an opportunity for them to get it out in whatever way is comfortable. So like whether it's, just hanging out with the guys, whether it's watching sports and, like just chilling. I think, for us as men, we're not taught to understand our emotions, right? We're not taught to, understand them and deal with them and, learn about them and to talk through our emotions. Where a lot of times we're taught to suppress it. So we're not even familiar with it. A lot of us don't even have the language really to talk about those things that are bothering us on, in a mental health space. And so I think it's interesting. I always say that for Black men, sometimes we can all be in the same space, in the same circle, dealing with the same things, and no one's talking about it. Right. And so I think, honestly, even if it comes out as humor, just taking a step into vulnerability and just talking about some of the things that you're experiencing. And, if it's not the group setting, then definitely just talking to a brother one-on-one, just saying, hey, do you have some time I can just, throw about this thing and, just throw it out there. If that's not the primary focus of the conversation and you just want to spend a couple of minutes getting off your chest, just do that. And I think what it does is that 1 minute, couple minutes of vulnerability can change not only the individual sharing, but the person receiving it. So then that brother knows like, oh, this is okay. Like, this is acceptable. Like, man, I was going through the same thing. I was dealing with the same stuff. And it kind of breaks down 2 silos, 2 barriers. And we start to create a circle and a dialogue amongst brothers to really talk about things that likely we've all, or someone in your group, someone in your friend circle, someone that someone at your barbershop, someone at your church has already experienced, and then we can learn and grow from one another. So I think modeling vulnerability, figuring out that you don't have to have all the words, it doesn't have to be polished, it could be clunky, whatever it is, just if you feel like the weight is too heavy to get off or to handle by yourself, definitely see if there's someone in your circle that you can share that weight, however you're able to get it off, and kind of build that amongst your brothers and your friend circles.
Yeah, and Aisha, do you think we're talking about this enough? Because, this is Mental Health Awareness Month, and lots of agencies are encouraging that these kinds of open conversations take place. That we do more to try to destigmatize mental health. But we know that's a huge hurdle, particularly in the Black community, overcoming that stigma and the way that we think about mental health as being different than even how we think about physical health, and the silence that often exists in our families, the way we whisper about people who we know have mental health issues, but we're not being open about it. So do you think there is enough conversation on a regular basis, not just during this month, about these topics?
I definitely think that there could be more conversation, and also just creating more safe spaces for people to get comfortable with communicating about how they feel. But I think the kind of barrier to that is that we as individuals have to be okay with, one, understanding what our needs are, understanding what some of our desires are, understanding how to articulate what it is that we may be feeling, and not allowing fear to hold us back. And so I think the more that we create spaces to talk about these things, to actually gain that confidence to talk about how we're feeling and things that we're going through, I definitely think that the communication will get better. But I do think that there needs to be continuous talk, more spaces for us to discuss mental health.
What do you think, Brandon, is the single most important thing we can do, particularly in the Black community, to destigmatize conversations around mental health?
I think sharing our lived experiences. It's not that we don't go through these things. We go through these feelings of, doubt, of fear. And, many of us have experienced mental illness and have been diagnosed with these things, whether it be major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, et cetera. I think talking about those things and being more open to say that, the people around you, like individuals in our community, like we've experienced this. Mental health isn't uncommon in our community. It may present different. Dr. Goodwill talked about, the precipitating factors, the risk factors. They may look a little different for us, especially, as racism and discrimination plays a role. But, beyond that, we've experienced this. And so people talking about that, and also talking about their recovery, their growth, their healing, and how mental health supports have helped them, whether it be seeking a mental health professional, a counselor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, how those individuals have helped them, group therapy. People are doing healing circles now in the African American community, but having these conversations and opening up and saying, hey, like I've, dealt with this, like I've struggled with this, but, I'm on my process of healing, and this is what has helped me. It may not be the same thing that will help you, but it starts that conversation of saying, like, this isn't something that is foreign to us. This isn't something that, is new to us, but this is something that we've experienced, and allowing people to know where those resources are. Like, I think I talk about my therapist all the time. My therapist is a Black woman. She's amazing. And, she's helped me through some really difficult times. And I talk about that, very openly, because I want, more of us to go. We don't have enough therapists of color right now, but there are a lot more than what we used to have. There are so many professionals out there waiting to connect with us, men, women, young, children also, as we know those suicide rates are, really impacting our community. But there are supports out there that are safe, that work, and there are people like us who've experienced this and have recovered from it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, talking openly about having a therapist, because again, when you think about, folks outside of the Black community, that concept of saying they had a therapist, in some ways, I think people thought that was something that was exclusive to wealthy people, or exclusive to rich people, or, a certain class of people had a therapist, that was a luxury item, like having maybe an interior designer or something, or having a private chef in your home. And wasn't thought to be something that was accessible and available to people of color and, middle class people and working people. Do you think, Aisha, that stigma or that myth, I should call it a myth, is changing, where people from all socioeconomic classes and people of color are recognizing that you don't have to be rich or white to have a therapist. It's not something just for, people we've seen on TV, like wealthy white women who are in therapy about, their husbands are cheating or whatever the stereotypes we may see portrayed in the media. Is that changing where Black people feel more comfortable saying, I have a therapist. I work at the local grocery store and I bag groceries, but I have a therapist?
I definitely think it's shifting. I even noticed it within my own friend group. I'm a therapist with a therapist, and I openly say that. And I do think that there are a lot of groups now that actually are catered towards helping people of color find people of color that are clinicians. So we have like therapy for Black girls, therapy for Black men. We have the Urban Clinicians Network. We have clinicians of color. There are a lot of different organizations out there that are geared towards helping, our community find clinicians of color. So I think that it's definitely that particular stigma. I definitely think we're in the process of dismantling it. But there are a lot of resources now for us.
And what about this hopelessness? You work with a lot of young people. Dr. Goodwill talked about, for kids, even under 12 years old, it's kind of hard as an adult to imagine that at 10 years old, you've already decided that you have nothing to live for. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing a lot of young people express that?
Yes, and it breaks my heart every single time. And I think that's why I'm so adamant and why I love the work that Pretty Brown Girl does, is because it's surrounded by empowering and getting that foundation laid of identity and getting that foundation laid for self-love. And that feeling of hopelessness that I've seen has stemmed from this idea that you're not enough, that it stems from this level of comparison. I know we've talked about social media and the role that it plays, but our young people have a lot of access to a lot of different things now that can cause this root of hopelessness and low self-esteem and lack of self-love. What do you think one of the
biggest drivers of that is?
The biggest drivers of the hopelessness?
Of hopelessness,
Mm-hmm. I definitely think it's just this idea that, and from what I've seen, honestly, I talk a lot about social media because that's where, especially working in the schools, that's where a lot of outside issues come from. Mm-hmm. And also if they don't feel like they're being validated or affirmed. Mm-hmm. So if I'm not used to hearing that I'm loved, if I'm not used to hearing that I'm enough or that I'm gifted or I'm skilled or you do this really well, if I'm only hearing what I'm not doing right, mm-hmm. and what I'm doing wrong constantly, then that's all that's going to be replaying in my mind. Our minds are so powerful. And so there's only one negative seed that needs to be planted that I'll just start rehearsing. Mm-hmm. And so it's this gap of not really knowing how to redirect our thoughts once something negative is said to me. And then I just continue to harp on that. So it could be something that happened last month, a week ago, a year ago that they've held on to, and it's constantly repeating in my head. And so I recite that, and now I'm not able to see anything positive about myself.
I'm just wondering though, with social media, how does any young person feel that validation that you're talking about when they are constantly, being bombarded with other people's best day of their lives? Mm-hmm. So what they're seeing from someone else is the best day of their lives. Mm-hmm. And even some people that tried to share, like we saw with Simone Biles, who tried to share her experience. Some people came down hard on her for not getting, for not being tough enough and, finishing at the Olympics. So we set these expectations for some young people like a Simone Biles and say, you got to be a super, athlete. Mm-hmm. And when she expressed what she was feeling, that people were more concerned about winning those medals than mm-hmm. dealing with her mental health. So you have someone like her who is achieved so much. And then you have the everyday kid that's, mm-hmm. Watching someone else like a Simone Biles or, like whoever it is they may idolize, who is riding around in fancy cars and jetting to parties with celebrities. And I saw this post yesterday. It was a mother and a daughter. A mother and a son. And the mother was saying, this is my Mother's Day gift. My son took me to the Christian Louboutin store and says, pick whatever you want, Mom. And he's maybe 25, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And they're posing with matching red bottom tennis shoes that, if you know anything about those shoes, they're at least probably $1,500 a piece. So here's a 25-year-old kid spending $3,000 on some tennis shoes, and the mom is going, hey, look at me and my son. So, and nothing wrong with that. That's that mom's prerogative. But if you're that kid, watching that, and you bought your mother, I don't know, some flowers at the grocery store, how do you feel looking at that?
So one thing that I always try to teach is reality versus illusion. And then this concept of healthy boundaries. So when we talk about social media, we have to make sure that we're teaching half of the stuff that we see and that you've had access to is not necessarily realistic. People, it's a highlight reel. And you have to choose what you're going to use social media for. And you have to understand what's realistic and what is not. And so that's when healthy boundaries come in. Am I someone who struggles with comparison? Do I maybe need to only follow things that are going to make me feel good, like traveling or cooking pages? Because social media it has a variety of different things on there. It's just what we're choosing to give our energy to. And so this concept of really defining what's realistic and what's not, and then what type of boundaries do I need to have? Because you do have control over that.
Yeah. And Brandon, you work at the Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services. What is the government doing? How is the government trying to address these issues? I heard Dr. Goodwill say that there was more grant funding for research around some of these mental health issues as they relate to African Americans. But what is the government doing, and can it be doing more?
Sure. So I can definitely speak to that. I'm not representing the government today, but I'll definitely talk about what's happening there. I think there's so much, right? So we, understand that this is an issue. There is a grant program called the Garrett Lee Smith State Tribal Grant Program. And so that's the largest funder of suicide prevention efforts across the country. We fund state, tribes, and territories specifically to do youth suicide prevention programming for young people between the ages of 10 to 24. And so as a part of that, we recently released a notice of funding opportunity, which has since closed, but it was for states, tribes, and territories. And some of the things that we added was, that states, tribes, and territories could address social determinants of health. So like we know that there are, other things that impact our young people in terms of, affordable housing and, education and access to mental health services, all those things that also influence mental health. So we talk about grantees being able to do this. And we also added language about making sure that the suicide prevention activities that our grantees are doing are particularly focused on the risk and protective factors for the racial ethnic groups that our grantees are serving. We want to make sure that, it's not a one size fits all approach to the work that's happening. We want to make sure that there are, specific, activities that address those things that Dr. Goodwill outlined, so perfectly in her opening remarks. And so making sure that that's there as well. There's also the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which is a federally funded resource center. Their website is sprc.org. I encourage anyone, if you're interested in doing suicide prevention work for any race, ethnicity, LGBTQ plus veterans, whoever, definitely go to that website. Their resource library is vast. And everything there, because it's government produced, is free and available to the public. So there's been increased conversations around this. We have a Center for Behavioral Health Equity that I've worked with to do some things there. And we also released, the Department of Health and Human Services released in 2020 a report to Congress on Black youth suicide. So it's public, it's on NIH's website. I encourage anyone to download that. I had the privilege of serving as one of the reps for SAMHSA on that. And so that particularly talks about what's happening to our youth. A lot of the things that Dr. Goodwill mentioned are there. New data from CDC's there. So there's definitely some work happening, and we're going to continue to push that and move that forward.
Oh, great. Glad to hear that. And we know there's also a suicide hotline that we like to let people know about. It's 1-800-273-8255. And I guess in a couple of months, we're going to get like a 3-digit
Yes.
number for, is that good just be for suicide or for mental health in general?
So that's for mental health needs and suicide prevention across the board. And so the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline will be, their number will be 988. So mid-July, around July 16th, I believe is the launch date. Anyone across the country will be able to dial the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline using the number 988. And so it'll be a 3-digit, easy to remember number. It'll patch you into your local crisis center. It has, resources and information about your local area. So it's also very specific to where you're calling in from. So it has
it's like a GPS. So if you call from Missouri, it's going to give you Missouri resources. If you call from Kansas or Massachusetts or wherever you are physically, it will automatically attach you with that local.
Absolutely.
Collection of agencies. Oh, that's fantastic. So you say it comes out mid-July or so?
Yeah, July 16th, I believe, is the official launch date where it'll be available. So the previous National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number that you just posted, that will still be active. That line is not going away. We'll just be adding the number 988 so people can remember that and dial in there as well.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I'll just end with you, Aisha. If there was one thing that you think we as a community, as parents, folks concerned about these startling statistics, particularly as they relate to Black youth, what can we do? What would you advise us to do?
Be open, have an open mind. Don't try not to come from a standpoint of trying to save, because usually when we're in a savior mindset, we could come off a little bit passionate, a little bit more harsh, but really just coming from a place of, I love you. And anytime you want to talk, we can talk. I'll do check-ins. Let me know if you're comfortable, speaking at this time, like Mr. Johnson mentioned, not being pushy, but just creating a space that feels safe. And honestly, that opens up, teens open up when you do that. So just coming from a place of love and not pushy and trying to play savior.
Well, I love that you said about trying to be a savior, because I think all of us feel like when we see someone in crisis that that's our job. Mm-hmm. And we instantly kind of jump into that savior mentality because we feel like that's what we should be doing. And Dr. Goodwill put it best when she said, even a trained professional individually, it can't do that. Typically, it's a team of very trained people working together to address mental health issues, because they are complex. They're not, it's usually not one thing. So thank you. Good advice. I think all of us have to learn to regulate our own emotions and our own impulses because we do, when we see someone in crisis, all of us want to be of help. But thank you for sharing with us, just to be open, just to create that safe space where people can share. Thanks so much, Aisha. Thanks so much, Brandon, for the work that both of you are doing and for helping us shed some light on these critical issues and give people some tools and resources that they can use as we continue during National Mental Health Awareness Month to do just what the agencies are asking us to do, which is to have these conversations, as uncomfortable as sometimes they can be. We have to acknowledge it, because we know we can't fix what we don't claim and acknowledge. So again, thanks to both of you for joining me this morning. All right, just want to thank everyone for being a part of the show, because these are very difficult conversations and they require us to talk about and read about and reflect on these really difficult cases involving teens, like the 15-year-old boy who is scammed and feels so humiliated that he kills himself, or the 19-year-old cheerleader who seems like she has so much to live for, but yet is so tortured internally that she kills herself. And there's so many of those stories. Those are just recent ones that caught my attention as I was researching for the show. But there's almost not a day that goes by that you don't see a story about suicide, whether it's a young person or older person. So we do have a mental health crisis, as Dr. Goodwill said at the beginning, in this country. 1 in 5, some numbers say 1 in 3, 1 in 4 people experience some form of depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues. So we've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We've got to get comfortable talking about this in the same way that we may talk about a broken leg or a broken arm or diabetes, or we share about those physical ailments or health issues that we have. We have to get comfortable talking about those emotional and behavioral and mental health issues. And I just want to leave you with 5 ways that you can support someone during this month. There's a great article that I found that shared many more, like 20, 25 different things that you can do during Mental Health Awareness Month. And these 5 stuck out to me. So I want, these are my words to live by today. These are the 5 things that we can do to offer support to someone that may be going through a mental health crisis. And the first one was attend an event in support of mental health awareness. No matter where you are, what city, what county, what state, there's some agency in your community that's posting something during this month, virtually or in person. Sign up and attend, because that's where you're going to get more information and resources about the signs and the symptoms and what you can do to be helpful. And number 2 is take a mental health first aid course and get certified. I'd never heard of this. You can become a certified mental health coach of sorts, where you yourself will learn some of the signs, the symptoms, and what you can do when someone is in crisis. In the way that we take CPR, and many of us are certified in CPR, you can get certified in mental health. You can go online, you can find different agencies that offer that certification. Many offer it for free. So think about that as something that you can do. Number 3, share your own story. I love that Brandon said he talks openly about having a therapist, as well as Aisha says she's a therapist with a therapist. Don't be embarrassed, ashamed of your story. And you never know who may be listening and watching when you share that story. You may be touching someone in another part of the country or another part of the world if you share that story, particularly if you share it on social media. And sometimes you may just share it intimately with one person or 2 people. But however you choose to do so, share your story, because others can learn from it. Number 4, create strong self-care practices. We talk a lot in this country about self-care, but how many of us are actually practicing self-care? I don't know. Whether that's soaking in a tub, taking a hike, going to a yoga class, having an afternoon cup of tea, meeting a girlfriend or a guy friend for a drink, going to a movie, whatever it is that allows you to just take a moment away from your hectic, busy schedule and pour something into yourself, whatever that is for you. Make sure you're taking some time to create and practice self-care. And 5, which I love, is celebrate good news. How often do we take time to smell the roses and celebrate good news? And I'm super excited. I told my production team this morning, I have some great news. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to talk with this big, talented, super successful New York literary agent who's interested in a book that I'm writing, my 5th book. And the book is about the stories and the people that I've had an opportunity and privilege to interview on this special report. So book isn't sold. We're a long way from selling it, a long way from me finishing or writing the manuscript and getting it into bookstores. But just the fact that this big agent found this topic, the topics we've been talking about on the special report, that they found them to be compelling enough to say, hey, we want to sign you and take your book out to the world and try to sell it. And that's what happens in the publishing world. You guys have heard me talk about that before with different authors about how hard it can be to get an agent. Particularly one of those big fancy New York agents. But I was fortunate enough yesterday to talk to one who says, hey, let's do this. Let's take this journey together. So that's my good news. And so make sure you're out there celebrating whatever good news is happening in your life. And we can always find something good to celebrate. Hey, I woke up this morning. That's good news too. All right, y'all, be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.